Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar called More Than Sustainability, Exploring the Benefits of EV Charging for BOMA Members. My name is Elizabeth France, and I'm the Director of Legal Services and Public Affairs at Flow, and I will be the host for today's session, presented in concert with BOMA International. We're very proud to be working with BOMA International to host today's discussion on EV charging in the commercial real estate industry. And I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us today. A couple of housekeeping matters. I'd also like to remind everyone that today's session is being recorded for future use and will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Similarly, I'd like to note that our attendees are muted so that our speakers are not interrupted. However, questions may be asked at any time by using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer some of these at the end of the webinar if there's time. So with that, we'll kick this off. EVs are becoming increasingly prominent on our roads, and charging stations are becoming more and more affordable. As this occurs, savvy commercial real estate vendors are beginning to realize the significant economic benefits to installing charging stations at commercial sites. Through their significant asset portfolios and consistent exposure to the public, commercial real estate organizations are well positioned to assist in the deployment of charging infrastructure, and in doing so could provide a value-added amenity to visitors while working to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, all while investing in a valuable asset that can assist with their bottom line. So those are really the topics we want to cover today, and we have three guests today who are particularly well positioned to talk about these issues. So I'll let the guests introduce themselves. We'll start with Don Erb, and then we'll move to Ringo Ng, and then Don Davis.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, depending upon which side of the world you're on. I am Don Erb. I am currently a Senior Sustainability Associate at the University at Buffalo in Buffalo, New York, as well as the Vice Chairman of the Professional Staff Senate at the University of Buffalo. I've been a Facilities and Property Manager prior to my current role for about 35 years, and in 2013 I was named a BOMA Fellow. UB is located on 3 campuses in the Buffalo area: downtown medical campus, a city campus at the edge of Buffalo, and then a main suburban campus in the town of Amherst. UB's enrollment is about 32,000 students and is home to approximately 5,900 faculty and staff. So that is me, Elizabeth.
Welcome. Ringo?
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you for having me. My name is Ringo Ng. I am the Senior Manager of Energy, working out of the Operations Services Group at Cadillac Fairview. Recognize there is a list of attendees from the US, so for those who do not know who Cadillac Fairview is, we are a globally focused owner, operator, investor, and developer of best-in-class real estate across retail, office, residential, industrial, and mixed-use asset classes. We manage in excess of $36 billion of assets across the Americas and the United Kingdom. Internationally, CF also invests in communities with like-minded partners, including Lincoln Property Company in the US. In my current role, I am responsible for managing a list of key energy-related initiatives, such as using analytics to drive energy and water conservation, alternative energy procurement and deployment, and managing and sustaining infrastructure like EV charging stations, just to name a few.
Great, thanks and welcome, Ringo. Lastly, Don Davis.
Oh, well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Don Davis. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Codes with BOMA International. I think, as everyone knows, BOMA International represents actually the global commercial real estate industry with 87 local associations throughout the United States and 28 international affiliate organizations such as BOMA Canada. So I am in charge of basically the policy development for BOMA International. We deal with everything from tax incentives to property management to pandemic management issues that have come up, and I am basically about 30 years, or it's getting to be 30 years. Let's just go with 28 years of experience in energy policy here in Washington, D.C., specifically in the built environment. I'm also an attorney licensed to practice in D.C., Maryland, and the Federal District Court. So that's me, right?
Well, welcome to all of you, and thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I've got some different questions that I'm gonna throw out to everybody, and I'll direct them specifically to you. And we've specifically tried to sort of come up with some questions that are often posed for clients in the commercial real estate space. So hopefully it will be really interesting to our listeners today. So the first one sort of has to do with procurement and deployment. And I'm thinking about Ringo and Don Erb, who will answer this question. But let me just sort of lay out some of the issues that might be interesting for our listeners today. Could both of you detail your charging deployments so far? Like, how many stations do you use? Are they level 2? Are they fast charging? And in deploying those stations, you know, what sort of decisions were you asked to make in sort of laying out those deployments, and what priorities sort of come into play, you know, when as a workplace or a commercial real estate organization, you have to choose a charging station solutions provider. So that was more than one question, but maybe I'll start with Ringo, and then we'll move to Don Erb.
Yeah, there's multiple layers of that question. So let me try to dissect that question a little bit. And I think it might be prudent to start off with describing how we approached our initial set of deployment and how we're approaching it now, just to give us some context. Historically, the decision to install these chargers is very well managed by local general managers at our different sites. So essentially, a general manager would respond to a need or a client request and investigate what is available on the market at that time, and they ultimately decide what to do there. What we found is that left us with a pretty fragmented setup, with inconsistently approaching this very key amenity, and also resulting in inconsistent client experience, where some sites would have some chargers, some sites would not. And for some sites that do have, we have different charging experience. So back in 2017, maybe to answer part of that question, Alice, back in 2017, we looked into this further, and we agreed that our properties, all being in major municipalities and in most cases along major highway routes, would be a prime site, would be prime sites for expanding Canada's charging network. So we approached Flow, and at the time we tried to work out a funding agreement at the time with the province to get these kicked off. We didn't end up getting that through, but we did keep the conversation going. And really in recognizing that these chargers are a key amenity that our tenants are looking for. And especially with our properties, you know, equipped with food courts and washroom and coffee shops and whatnot, we feel that could be a good point for them to stop by and get charged up. So again, back in 2017, Flow and CF then signed a partnership. And in the beginning, we deployed 45 of these chargers at 15 of our sites to start. And from there, we are building to the future growth where, you know, 4 chargers per building, you know, was the right solution at the time. But in 10 years, we anticipate the number could go up. And I think we witnessed that for the last couple of years. In those markets that we deployed chargers, we were, in some markets, we were the first to offer level 3 chargers. And so we were very proud at the time. And we also worked with Tesla to install superchargers in our parking lot. I guess to the second part of your question, the procurement kind of approach. I think what we found is Flow provided many options that were very key to us. For instance, bilingual was important, where we have a majority of the country speaking French and the other majority speaking English. We need a company that could deliver that seamless bilingual service. Having electronic and smart charging devices was key as well. So if a charging station goes offline on odd occasions, Flow would know about it much earlier than we do, and more than the ops manager would do at the site. And a service call would be made to have a truck rolled out and get that addressed. So that was a key component for us as we decide on who to partner up with. And I guess over the years, back to the third part probably of your question, over the years, we continue to work with Flo and Tesla, and we currently have 350 of these EV supplying equipment in our sites. Most of them are level 2. And with Tesla, we have 20 bay superchargers in I think more than half a dozen of our sites already. And just before COVID happened and hit us hard, we recorded close to about 500,000 sessions, 500,000 sessions of charging to date. So that was a pretty impressive number from what we experienced.
That's great, Ringo. Thank you so much. And it's always helpful to hear the progression as people are getting into this space and going from, 40 to I think 350 charging stations is really significant, and you have a lot of experience managing that. Let's turn to Don Erb and hear a little bit about your deployments and what your experience has been.
Sure. So this is more of a kind of a corporate installation, right? At an institution like a university. So we actually years ago we had only a few locations, 3 dual charging stations, level 2. Now, in the last 3 or 4 years, though, we have added 20 dual WAN level 2 charging stations on our 3 campuses. And our downtown campus, which is really it's a medical center that's shared by a variety of different entities. There's 21 single WAN stations down there on the medical center campus. Now, just like any corporation or business, there's a lot of demand for your capital dollars, and the installation of EV is no different. So cost, of course, is a big factor. So when you can get an incentive from a government or a utility, that is enormous. So that's what's happening now in New York State, where it's almost impossible not to put these in. This is a great time to get in front of it, because you want to stay in front of this. This is a trend that's going to rapidly ramp up. So we started off with about 40 or 50 subscribers back about 6 years ago, and now we're up to about 500 subscribers. But when you consider there's 500 subscribers out of almost 40,000 students, staff, and faculty, there's a lot of room for additional subscription, but also a lot of room for visitors to be able to come on campus and use those devices. The procurement side has been made pretty easy for us. In New York State, there's a program called Charge Ready New York, and while we had a relationship through the utility with our provider, there's actually 25 pre-qualified network selection providers on Charge Ready New York, and Flow is actually one of them, and so it's really difficult not to be able to ramp this up and do it quickly from a state perspective. And so for those of you who are not in New York State, which I'm sure there's many, that's a pressure that you should be applying to your utilities and your state public service commissions to try to get those incentives for you, so that you can bring those charging networks on more quickly in your state or your province.
Thanks, Don. That was really, really helpful and a great different kind of perspective from the university look at it. Maybe I'll turn now to Don Davis and see if there's anything you want to weigh in sort of on best practices in terms of decision process for installing commercial infrastructure, or just any comments you might have. You're on mute, Don.
Sorry. I thank you for the question. I think this is a really important area of discussion on what kind of decisions or thinking should go into whether or not we're going to install these and how are they going to be installed. I think it's important for the building owners to, first to start and take a look and say, well, what are the local regulations? And, what I mean by that is if we're offering an amenity, there is a way that there's a business model that's attached to that. But there are going to be local regulations that are going to govern that, particularly if we're talking about the sale of electricity. So we're going to put this in. How are we going to get a rate of return on it? How is it going to work? In many jurisdictions, anybody but a qualified and recognized utility is prevented from selling electricity. So that will depend on what kind of business model that you go forward with. So I think it's very important that there's an in-depth look at what kind of state and local regulations are dealing with that. I think it's important to consider what kind of technology mix is going to be installed. So, remember, not all electric vehicles have the same kind of connectivity to a charging point. So a Tesla is different than a Leaf. And I think it's important that if you're trying to offer that service, that there be more than one type available, particularly if it is an amenity to the building. You don't determine what kind of car is going to drive in to the building, or as a tenant. So if it is something you're going to offer, you want to make sure that you have this mix. Otherwise, you might have a whole bunch of Teslas who cannot be plugged into to that particular charging point. I think opportunity cost is an important point as well. In looking at the business model and what can be done with those parking spaces, if you give up that parking space and dedicate it to a charge point, it means it's not available. Typically not available, right, for other uses, and so there's that consideration as well. I mean, I think there's a lot more to be said and a lot to be thought about as we think through how these are installed. And I don't know if we're going to touch on this later or not, but the number one thing for us is always looking at the ability of ensuring that this is an amenity that is being offered, and that there is potential for this to be looked at as a utility. And when it is looked at as a utility that needs to be available widely to the public, it does raise a number of other issues, such as private property rights, access to that utility, and the kind of rights that you would give up if it became a public utility. So again, we're very supportive and think that this is a great way to address climate change issues if the policy is developed right. But again, lots of thought has to be put into how this amenity is being installed and then offered to the public.
That's great, Don. Thanks very much. And I certainly know from my work in the policy sphere that issue of, are charging stations considered utilities is at the forefront, and one certainly that different groups are looking at and advocating for, making that seamless for owners, so that they don't fall within those regulatory restrictions or burdens and those types of things. And I know we're making lots of progress in that in terms of some of our Canadian provinces and US states and that sort of thing. But I think your comments are helpful and excellent in terms of, just some of the key considerations and guidelines to think about when you're thinking about installing EV charging. And I'm going to move now to kind of my second question, which I think fits really well with what we've been talking about. And that's sort of the idea of like right sizing and future proofing, and exactly sort of what you were talking about, Don Davis, in terms of like making sure the use case sort of matches what we'll put in there. And so I wanted to sort of direct the first question to Ringo, who, they've put in a lot of EV charging stations at Cadillac Fairview, and wanted to sort of ask, what do you do to ensure the technology that you install today will be capable of servicing EV drivers in a few years into the future? What sort of considerations do you apply when you're thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think I can start with saying that right sizing and future proofing could be looked at separately, but also together. And the reason I say that is there are a variety of EVs available. And to Don's point, not all EV can be plugged into the same charge point. So for instance, if we took a look at fast chargers, they come in 50, 100, 200 kilowatt. We have to recognize that not all the EVs today on the road can take that higher range. So right sizing now means that we don't want to necessarily just dedicate a charging point to the higher range ones. But with that said, in the eyes of future proofing, on the other hand, what we have done as CF is we made sure that we're not stuck with a piece of hardware that cannot be upgraded or replaced readily. We want to make sure that we don't run into a situation where we would encounter obsolete closed source communication protocols with the infrastructure that we put in. We want to make sure that the technology and the partner that we choose to work with have the ability to adapt for expanding the network and footprint of charging stations. And with that said, with the initial round of deployment here at CF, we made sure that we work with flow and we accommodate the infrastructure twice the charges we are putting in the first place. So, you know, in the case of doubling our EV charging stations in the 5 years, we need not rip out the whole parking lot again and put in the essential hardware and the conduits to enable that. So to put things into perspective, we initially went in with 1 level 3 and 2 level 2 charging stations at each of our retail sites. And we made sure that, again, the infrastructure is able to accommodate double that size. In the case of Tesla, it's a bit different, where to begin, we have 20 superchargers for each of those sites. And those are, 20 superchargers is a massive deployment and size to begin with. So I think that's, kind of my take on right sizing and future proofing.
No, that's very, very helpful, and it seems like one of the key points you're mentioning is sort of being able to upgrade technology as you see fit and as that is demanded by tenants and consumers and that sort of thing. Don Erb, let me turn to you and see if you have any comments on future proofing or right sizing from your perspective.
Well, it's a great question, and I don't think you can future-proof anything, but I think that the plug-and-play kind of mentality of being able to upgrade or change softwares or change wands or those kinds of things is important for any kind of an infrastructure. We don't really know where this is going to go just yet. They're talking about, depending upon which article you read or who you talk to, you could have up to 160 new vehicle models out in the next few years. And these are exciting cars, right? It's not just for the environmentalists. These are high torque and fast acceleration vehicles, which is going to be very attractive. And as we approach parity in price, people are going to want to buy these cars. So you're going to want to be able to stay ahead of it. This is going to the gas station. You can't, it takes a half an hour or so to get a decent amount of energy out of this. So we're going to have to see. And but the plug and play value of this is very important.
Great, thank you. Don Davis, I don't know if you want to chime in with anything from your views on future proofing or right sizing.
Right, no, sure, I do think, because I think this is an incredibly important point, and I think both Ron and the other Don make points that we all agree with. I mean, from our perspective, you have to remember, we're the ones in most cases that, building owners and the building managers that are making the direct investment in this technology. Let's put this into our building. And in many cases in existing buildings, which this, is not as it's being built, so the cost can be, quite large. So when we look at it, it's not going to be a good amenity for us to offer if we've invested in this, and 3 years from now, the type of connectivity is different than it was today, right? I think Don was correct in saying we don't know, the only thing we know about future technology is that, I think this is what he was saying, is that it will evolve and it will be different. So for us, it's very important that what we are able to do is recapture that investment and be able to see a rate of return on that investment before things start to evolve. From my perspective also, just, looking at this overall, we think, and it's really the car companies, I think, that, need to be encouraged on this, that as they move closer to larger economies of scale, we need to see something that's more universal. We can't have every single car brand have a different way to connect. And I think that, there's effort that needs to be done there. Obviously, we're seeing the folks that develop the charging stations and that part of the infrastructure respond to the kind of vehicles that they're given. And it would be very difficult if Hyundai and Toyota and BMW all made different ways to connect. And frankly, for the consumer, I don't think it would be that great. You would be driving around half of your charge looking for a charge station that was compatible with your vehicle. So, I mean, those are our major concerns with, future proofing, and it's just, to ensure that we can recoup that investment But we just think, many times people don't understand this about BOMA. We're very concerned and very supportive of new technologies that, address energy efficiency, that address climate change issues. We just want to see them done in the right way. And we think this issue, electric vehicles and the charging points are a great way to address that. We're just concerned in some cases that people aren't enough thought put into the background.
No, those are really helpful comments, and I'm sure really helpful to our listeners who are contemplating these things and thinking about the different, obstacles and challenges and opportunities that might arise when they're thinking about installing this type of technology. I want to turn now sort of to what a few of you have alluded to is sort of the business model and sort of the economic side of charging on commercial properties. And so I can tell you that from where we sit, we get a lot of questions about whether, EV charging can present a viable economic opportunity to those who are willing to install stations. And, certainly in our experience, charging at commercial sites can drive shoppers to the spaces, keep them on site to shop for longer and provide in some ways a valuable asset that can be ROI positive, over the station's life. So Don Davis, you sort of alluded to this a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about your views on the economic viability of EV charging and how that might be a benefit?
Yes. Yes. So that is this is also one of principally one of our number one concerns is that this really is a business model. First, I want to say that, and I think it goes beyond just are we making money off of the actual installation? It's going to bring people into our buildings. There's no question that, and I don't want to dance around this, the pandemic has changed almost everything for our industry. We are rethinking the way buildings are used. People are rethinking their desire to be in a commercial space, whether it's retail or whether it's commercial office space. One of the things that we look at charging stations is an amenity that will draw people in. It's not just charging stations for us. People also now want, high speed, high definition internet, which is better than they have at home. That's going to draw them into the building. So we're looking at a suite of, amenities that will continue to bring people in and that the buildings can fulfill their useful purposes. So, this in particular, as a business, as a business opportunity, we see the business model as we're going to bring people in. It's going to, filled lease space, but we can also earn a profit. There can be a rate of return on these systems, as long as we have actually talked about as long as we consider the other things that we've talked about, which is, is it the right mix so that people are actually plugged in and charging? The issue on local regulations is very important because that determines whether we're going to be in the business of selling electricity. Some states like California have allowed for that to happen. In other words, selling by the kilowatt hour or how long you're plugged in. Other states have not. Other states have said you are not going to do that at all, or there's legislation pending that hasn't passed yet. And so the business model then is we rent it out by the hour, right? Or we would rent it out by the day. So as opposed to maybe a $20 a day's parking space, you would rent this one out at $5 an hour to be able to include that charge in it. What it comes down to, though, all in the end, the business model is that we see this as an amenity. We see that the area where this amenity is offered is private property and not a utility. And if it's managed right, and these other considerations are taken into account as they're developed, it can be a great revenue source. And that can go beyond just the point where we're charging, but can also increase and improve the value of the overall building.
No, I think those are really helpful comments, and especially the COVID considerations and how we've really seen many things change as a result of working from home and doing, using public and commercial spaces a little bit differently. Don Erb, let me ask you if you've got any kind of thoughts on the viability or economic viability of charging stations and how that might be useful.
Yeah, there's a few things here. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure that our viewers heard today was the concept of sustainable return on investment. Everybody knows what ROI is, but ROI is only one aspect of running a business in the 21st century, and sustainability is an important aspect to running your business as well. So in our case, just as an example, we intend to be carbon neutral in 8.5 years, which is not a lot of time. So while we certainly have competition for various projects on campus, we want to make sure that we are reaching that goal and getting to carbon neutrality in that time frame. And this is one of the 10 strategies that we are employing to get there. So I think that as more companies and developers become interested in sustainability and ESG matters, they're going to want to be able to consider that idea of sustainable ROI. The economics could not be better right now in New York State to do this. As I said earlier, there's great incentives right now. You can almost get, your EV charging stations installed, your level 2s installed for no cost. Within certain parameters. You can't run wire for miles to get from your electrical panel to your charging station location, but within reason. And then something that we've talked about previously, Elizabeth, was that this whole idea, if you're in a mixed use property, some of our colleagues have found out that as a shopper, you will stay 50 minutes longer at retailer, and you will spend on average of $1 more a minute while you're waiting. So that's a big plus. That's a big economic boost to a retailer and a mixed use property. So I think there's many reasons for a positive economic outlook on EV.
That's really interesting, and looking at sort of the dwell time of shoppers and how that translates into actual dollars for the commercial real estate spaces is super interesting, Don. Ringo, from your perspective at Cadillac Fairview, that obviously cares about the economics and the environmental aspects of things. Do you want to offer any sort of comments on this?
Yeah, I guess starting off is saying that, Don, what an impressive goal that you'll be having, trying to achieve carbon neutral in 8.5 years. So kudos to you. So I guess I might just add on a little bit more, not too much other than what you guys have already described. But the way that we see it is there are many ways to support sustainability initiatives. Some initiatives support the reduction of environmental footprint of our own building. But we have others that support the local community in transforming into a low carbon economy quicker. And I think we believe the EV charging stations is directly contributing to the latter by providing the infrastructure, the ease for EV drivers to hop on these sites and ease that range anxiety. We always talk about range anxiety, and where our sites are located in major highway routes, we believe we're achieving that goal. And I think the stats that we have, the 500,000 sessions just before COVID that we accumulated speaks for itself. And I think we like to think of ourselves in that we make a dent in reducing carbon in the community that we operate in.
Thanks very much for your comments, Ringo. And I think that, I was just hoping, and you guys spoke to all of these, that both the economic and the environmental benefits that you've considered and that can arise from installing EV charging in commercial properties. I want to move to another area, sort of power management. It's another question that we get often, and that I think is useful for viewers to kind of consider. And so, in commercial spaces, particularly where buildings are already really heavily drawing on the grid, EV charging deployments, as some of you may know, can leverage, power management technologies that can help site owners sort of avoid those peak demand charges by either scheduling or throttling power where necessary. And so always helpful to hear how those principles sort of apply in practice. And so I want to ask you, Don Erb, do you guys use any of those types of technologies in your deployments, or do you have any comments or helpful guidelines on thinking about those?
We do some things that are kind of maybe atypical, maybe a little old fashioned. So we peak shave when necessary. You know, demand charges can be up to $10 a kilowatt hour in New York State. Our normal cost is about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So you know, we are connected to 64 other university campuses in the state of New York. So when we get information from our main office in Albany, we can begin to coast buildings and shed load. So that is a little different than what you're talking about. But I think one of the things, Elizabeth, that's going to be important going forward as we shift to electric vehicles for service on our businesses and our campus, including buses, that'll be done at night. Okay, so they will take advantage of off-peak hour charging for those vehicles to the greatest degree possible. And they will also, as battery technology continues to improve for storage of power, we will begin to obviously use that as a lever to when we use our EV charging. And then the last thing, just kind of as a more of a bragging point, is we're in the middle of installing 12 megawatts of solar energy on our campus, and I'm sure we will leverage that solar energy to also shave costs. So a little different for us, but still possible to do these things even if you don't have a large piece of property in a college campus.
No, that's great, and I think it's really helpful to hear sort of the unique ways that you're addressing this, Don Erb. Let me turn to Don Davis. You know, do you have any thoughts on how we can sort of maintain this relationship between, you know, the healthy relationship with the power grids and the commercial properties? Do you have any thoughts you can share with everybody on that?
Yeah, so, and I kind of want to go back to the last question that you asked, because there is some, you know, concerns there. You know, we have been thinking about this. I mean, if you think about so, you know, as I said in my introduction, you know, I've been working on energy policy for 20 years plus. You know, the issue with electric cars and electric vehicles when this policy started back, you know, in the mid 90s, was that we were trying to solve the issue of peak demand, that there was a lot of generation at night that was wasted and that was overly peak at night. And the concept was electric vehicles should be charged at night, which is great. You know, you're getting, you know, a uniform generation line, and you're able to take electricity off of the grid that may otherwise not have anywhere to be, you know, to be used. What has occurred now and in this policy is that we're going to bring all of these vehicles to the city center and plug them in during the day when we're already experiencing peak demand in the buildings. So that raises a few issues for us. One, which what Don was saying is great, right? Investment in renewables, right? They're making solar, but we're not seeing that type of robust investment or, R&D into making renewables to replace that. So if you double the electric demand in the city centers during the day, it's just going to increase peak, which is, by the way, going to impact the business model because the electricity is going to be more expensive. But having said that, if it's not done with renewables, right? If it's not done with renewables, then you are looking at increased carbon because they're just going to generate with what they're able to generate with, which currently globally is 98% fossil fuels. America, the United States, of course, and Canada, North America, and Western Europe are much advanced in renewables, but most of the rest of the world is not. So that's the overall figure. You can't get away from it. The other issue that we're very concerned about is that a lot of the energy usage that buildings are subject to for their energy requirements at the state and local level are based on their Energy Star their Energy Star performance ratings, right? And that's where their baseline comes from. And although I think Energy Star is working on it, and we've had a few meetings with them where we've discussed this briefly, this increased demand on the building could potentially put all of these buildings out of compliance with their minimum energy usage, which we're not seeing a lot of recognition that this could be coming from electric vehicles. It certainly is something that will be solved. I mean, I'm not saying that this is not going to be addressed, but it's another consideration that's not being made. Now we have a much larger baseline figure because we're using electricity. So I don't want to sound too negative on any of this because I do believe that this is a great policy. It's a great solution to climate change, to carbon emissions that we're all trying to struggle with, whether it's net zero or just trying to get to the scientific recommendations of 350 parts per million by 2100. This is really a big step forward, but how we get there is really important. For our building owners, again, if it affects their baseline and there's no consideration given, that's a concern. If we then are, say, in our business model saying, well, this parking spot is $10, right? But then we get some kind of peak demand surge pricing, we're actually going to be losing money. So I think those are just more considerations. We have actually just published a white sheet on our policy on electric vehicles and charging stations, which is available on BOMA.org. It gives some pros and some cons and sort of discusses all these issues. So I'd encourage everyone to go and take a look at that if they have the opportunity. You can download it from the advocacy website at BOMA.org.
That's great and super helpful to have a reference, Don, because these issues are complex and multifaceted, and it's helpful to sort of be aware of the challenges so that we can sort of address them head on. Ringo, do you want to chime in at all on power management or if that is a consideration at all for Cadillac Fairview?
Yeah, maybe just a quick note. I think Don Davis and Don Erb both made really good points there. I think on top of trying to manage the relationship between these charging stations with the building, I think the conversation has evolved as to how these charging stations will behave and coordinate and have a relationship with the grid itself. So I think that's a very top of mind topic that we have, especially when in the city of Toronto, for instance, all new buildings starting in 2022. If they want to get a site plan approval, we need to install 20% of our parking stalls with charging stations. And what does that mean for the city? How does that mean for the rates in general that the city would be bearing? That's pretty top of mind. And I think just going back to what CF has done in trying to mitigate this power demand issue or cost avoidance issue, we actually have for the most part, segregated out the EV charging station off of separate accounts, separate utility accounts. So, it won't be blended into the base building baseline. And it's also easier for us to understand how much energy, how much electricity that they're drawing. And also avoiding, peak demand charges, because as Don Davis has mentioned, these charging stations in downtown core are typically heavily used, especially during peak hours. So, in avoiding, having the baseline jumping into a higher baseline with the charging stations plugged in, we strategically tried to parse them out as much as we could.
No, that's really helpful. And obviously from a policy perspective, there's lots of discussion going on about, specific EV charging rates and demand, trying to sort of address demand charges and sort of the negative impact they can have because they're a really different use case in some ways than how demand charges were classically thought of and developed. So no, very, very helpful comments. I have one more question I want to draw on, and that is going to bring us back a little bit to data and data analytics. And one of the things that we get asked a lot from our clients is, what are best practices? What should we be doing? And the one thing that we often come back to is, looking at your charging station data to be able to make, informed decisions about uptake, optimization, expansion, and those types of issues. And so, Ringo, maybe I'll start with you and ask, do you guys use data analytics, in your work, and how does that sort of inform your decisions or enhance the charging experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, we do rely on data. We lean quite heavily actually on the smart devices that Flow has provided, and even Tesla as well, where they would, basically we're enabled now to judge and gauge how frequent our charging stations are being used, how long they're being used for. Are they being abused in terms of having a car plugged in and not being pulled out? Like, we have all those data to help us in making much more informed decisions. I think, one example was one of the Toronto downtown building. We initially had a bunch of charging stations installed, but we found that folks are waiting in line to get a charging session. And then through the data, we found out that yes, the stations are being abused in terms of having a car plugged in for extended period of time. So in response to that, we charge a nominal fee, $1 an hour, and that actually helped deter those behaviors. So that's just one example. And I think the other key one that I just want to impress on the audience here today is the ability to understand where we should invest and expand on our current network. Without these data, we're oftentimes left pondering and often left to qualitative speculation as to where in 60 of our sites across Canada requires an expansion. And we would go out to different general managers and different operations manager and regional directors and ask for their advices. And because they don't have a good way in quantitatively understand the need and the requirement, then we're going to receive a lot of qualitative, the speculation. But with data, we'll be able to say, we have these shopping centers in Quebec that are experiencing 9 or 10 charging stations last year, and then they're experiencing 12 to 13, and we just expect that to just keep skyrocketing, and we can then project out where do we need to put on an additional charging station. And then we can see that, in perhaps downtown Vancouver, in a building where we only have 2 charging stations, a charging session a day, and then we know that we don't need to focus on that part of the country as much. So absolutely, I think data is very helpful and it allow us to make much more informed decisions.
That's really helpful, Ringo, to have that, real life experience about how you guys actually use the data to be proactive in your deployments and anticipate sort of needs. Don Erb, let me turn to you and see if do you guys use data analytics at all in looking at charging, or is that something that features in your systems?
Absolutely, we use data. It's so important to know, all the who, what, where, when, and why of what the EV charging session is about, and what the uptake is, how fast the people are turning over. We're in a situation where we do not charge for the electricity yet because of our tariff, but going forward, that is going to more than likely happen. So policy will need to be made, and you can't make policy without knowing who your customer is and what the data is, because maybe what it comes down to is we don't need additional stations at our university campuses. Maybe we need fast charge stations on the highways so that folks coming from greater distances can get on and get out and get over to our university campuses faster. We can't know that unless we have data. So it's so important to have that information, to know where they work, where they live, how much they need, and so on. So yes, that's as you choose a provider, a network provider, that has to be a strength.
And maybe I'll turn now to Don Davis. At BOMA International, do you guys have any, best practices or suggestions in terms of, data or analytics or things that you would recommend to your members, or anything on data that you want to share?
Well, we really rely more on, this is really not a role for BOMA International in terms of determining data on where they might place different or varying products. So we more focus on the policy development as Don was talking about, and I think that's more the area that we would focus on.
Great. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you, everybody. I think we have a few minutes left for questions, and I'm just going to have a look in our chat here to see what we might have. And so let me look here. What would be the optimum number of chargers and utilization rate for a typical location? And so I'm sure that that varies a lot based on, you know, what location and that sort of thing. But Ringo, why don't we start with you, and if you have any thoughts, and then we can move through the group.
Yeah, it's a loaded question, and unfortunately, it's one of those. It depends, and I say that because if you look at a suburban retail center that we operate, where we don't charge people to park, so you know, in those cases, people can just come into a parking lot to choose their just parking spots of their desire. You know, typically speaking, for those type of drivers, which we also will be charging them for each charging session, typically they would just plug in for half an hour, 1 hour, and then they would vacate the space. And in those cases, if the shopping center operates, you know, from 9 to 6, that's 9 hours for the day, then we should expect a 9 session per day kind of level. And I think if it goes beyond, again, the 12 to 13, I think we're going to start having those dialogue with our providers and suggesting that, hey, I think our drivers are waiting in line for the charging session. But the observation is quite different if we are to provide these amenities in our office towers, where, you know, in downtown core, we charge for parking, you know, in the parking underground parking levels, and in those cases, we are more forgiving, where people could park their car for a few hours, for instance, at a time, and not having those nominal charges. So I think it depends, and I think in an office setting, I would say 2 or 3 charging sessions could be what we strive for. And it really depends also if your charging spot is behind the paywall or in front of the paywall of those downtown locations.
Don Erb, do you have any comments? I know it's a broad question in terms of optimum number of charging stations, but you may have some thoughts on that.
I think Ringo really laid it out really quite well. You really have to know your market and your customer. You have to, like, we know, for instance, because we get data from our parking network here at the 3 campuses, we know that the average commute is, for instance, like in the 32-mile round trip range. You don't need to be on a charger necessarily if you are within 32 miles of the office. So that stalls the need to install more EV charging stations. But that's going to change over time. More vehicles, more on the road, more models. So you really have to continuously monitor that data and then stay in front of it so that people can have enough to top off their tank, if you will, so they can make it home.
Don Davis, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, sure. So, but I want to kind of answer it this way, because, you know, obviously to be able to determine that, you do need the data. And as I said, you know, we look more at policy. You know, one of the things I think about, you know, where they should be and how much is the mix, and where, you know, where we determine is really market driven. And I think this a little bit what Don was talking about. You know, it depends on where the market is for those. What we're really concerned about, and on the policy side, is the mandates that are coming through. You know, we, you know, look at mandates of so many spots per, you know, per square footage of a parking, but then are those really being used, right? You know, are people really actually over at the shopping center or going to school at the university, where they actually do need to be plugged in, and yet we have mandates that they have determined the city center must have so many, and we're not making you know, a rate of return on it. It doesn't make any sense. We had this problem in proposed legislation in Hawaii, where you had, you know, tens of thousands of mandated proposals, right? These legislative proposals failed, but tens of thousands of spaces, you know, proposed for, like, say, the big island of Hawaii, where 50,000 people live and there's 500 cars, right? But you may have a better market case for putting that number in downtown Honolulu, depending on how things were working. So, I mean, I think that that's the number one thing. I think that the you know, the market is going to drive at some point these charging stations to highways where people are trying to get to point A to point B, yep. And they're going to need a fast charging station to get there. I think that's how we would think about it. If you're going to hear BOMA International in the future talk about how should this be how should these be placed, and how should they operate, it's market demand. It's market-driven forces that are determining where these are, not state mandates that are determining that they're going to be, located in on the third, basement floor of a, of a parking structure in a downtown commercial office building.
Those are very helpful comments. I'm going to direct us to one more and see if we have time for that. I've also noted people are interested in that report. You mentioned Don Davis, so maybe we can put a comment in the chat about the website. They can find it, and everybody's interested in the contact details. So we'll make sure to pass those along. I want to direct our question to this question on reliability, which is how does reliability, both on a hardware and a software level, impact your evaluation of potential charging solutions partners? And so, we've heard, and I think someone talked a little bit about charging anxiety or range anxiety today. People worried about not being able to charge, and now we're seeing, even more discussion about charging anxiety, getting to a charging station and it doesn't work. So, maybe I'll start with Ringo again. How does reliability sort of impact the decisions you make? And then we'll go to Don Erb and Don Davis.
Yeah, just to be quick, it's key. It's so prime. If we think of it as a amenity, it's no different than Wi-Fi connection or internet connection, right? It's very frustrating if I were to go into a retail center and I realize that my cell phone doesn't have reception. So, in that kind of lens, we have to make sure that we're choosing the right partner with a great reliability and also service level. Can't stress it enough. Our office tenants, when they pull into this parking spot after a 30-mile, 50-mile drive, they expect it to work, and if it doesn't work, it's a problem. And I think being a differentiator, like EV charging station being a differentiator for our business, we need to make sure that we can rely on them, we can lean on them as we need them to.
That's great. Don Erb, does this issue come up at all for the use of your charging stations, the concerns of reliability?
Oh my goodness, yes. So when I was directly involved with the EV charging originally, we had a great deal of reliability issues, and winter happens in Buffalo, believe it or not. So between weather and people having concerns about being able to hook up to their vehicle, there's a lot of service that's required. So you have to manage that expectation with your provider, and you have to make sure that all the aspects of charging are taken care of. Who's repairing? How do I get my data fixed when I can't see my data? How do I find out from my customer that they're having an issue? All those things have to be cared for, because if it's not cared for, then your subscribers become very nervous about being involved, and you don't want that. You want them to be involved.
And the last word for Don Davis. Any comments from your perspective on charger reliability?
Well, I think we agree, so since we don't, BOMA itself does not, install and manage, run these, but from, our members and owners' points of view is if it's offered as an amenity and it's not there, just as Ringo was saying, right, we've got upset people in our building, particularly if they're, tenants who, the people are relying on that as a, transportation back and forth. You could be stranded if you were not topped off, when you got to work. I also think that, the reliability, would be an issue in terms of ensuring that it's consistently generating a profit, right? We've made this investment. We'd like to see the money come back. So I think that those are the issues. Frankly, we've not heard a lot of, feedback from our members that the products that they've installed don't work. Once they get them in and they work, it's a great amenity. And obviously their maintenance folks, are maintaining, those facilities. So I think that's what I would say about that. And I just, again, I did post in the chat the web address for where you can take a look at and download our electric charging vehicle guide. There's also a link in there because I also noticed in the chat that someone had asked about what states are, and there's a link that should be available there too. If it's not, it will be later today, to a matrix of the 38 states that currently have pending legislation regarding the installation of charging stations. So that should be a good resource for folks to get to understand what's going on in their state.
No, that's great, and a great resource for everybody, and thank you all so much for your time today. We won't have time to answer more of the questions, but always excellent to get feedback. People are interested in these issues, and hopefully we'll continue the dialogue. But from everyone at Flow, thanks so much to Ringo, Don Davis, and Don Erb for your time and your expertise on this. Certainly valuable to get insights from folks who are familiar with this area and can pass down the knowledge to others considering it. So thanks everyone. I hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Elizabeth. Bye-bye.